Hello and welcome to Insomniac Dose. You're welcome to comment your city and the time below. I always enjoy reading them. If you find these stories interesting, please consider subscribing. Let's start tonight's story. The tide mirror broke at 2:53 in the morning. That's the only way I know how to describe it. The water stopped being water and started being something else. A surface, flat and dark and wrong, like a window someone had laid horizontal across the rock shelf. And in that surface, the tower stood twice. Two structures, two sets of blinking amber lights, two versions of the same terrible place I had no business being in. He was backing away from the shoreline, and I could see his face clearly for the first time since he'd knocked on the door hours ago. He looked like a man who had already accepted something I hadn't caught up to yet. His badge caught the tower light, faded, water-damaged, older than it had any right to be. "If you leave," he said, "our reality stabilizes." He didn't finish the sentence, he didn't have to. Outside, across the sandbar, the figure walked toward both of us, not fast, not slow. Just steady the way a tide moves, like something that has all the time in the universe and knows it. Its two shadows stretched in opposite directions across the wet rock, one pointing toward the ocean and one pointing inland, which is geometrically impossible because there was only one source of light. I looked at the rule sheet in my hand. I looked at the water. I stepped outside the tower. 3 weeks earlier, I signed the paperwork without reading it. The coastal weather station sits on a narrow strip of rock between the ocean and a marsh that floods twice a day with the indifference of something that has been doing the same thing for 10,000 years and intends to continue indefinitely. It isn't abandoned. It's automated, and the distinction matters to the agency, which is why they include it on every briefing document. Automated, not abandoned. As if the semantic difference is enough to make a technician feel comfortable spending 3 weeks alone in a structure that cannot be reached by road. Every month, someone has to visit for manual calibration. The sensors that measure coastal atmospheric pressure, wind shear, and tidal fluctuation are sophisticated enough to run themselves, but not sophisticated enough to run themselves correctly without periodic human adjustment. Someone has to lay their hands on the equipment. Someone has to be there. That someone was currently me. My name is Daniel Marsh, and I want to be precise about the circumstances of my arrival because I've since learned that context matters more than I initially understood. And I was sent there officially because I hold a certification in atmospheric sensor maintenance and have 6 years of field experience with coastal monitoring equipment. Unofficially, I had volunteered with a speed that the agency found mildly suspicious, because I needed somewhere isolated while a legal investigation played out back home. The kind of investigation that doesn't go on your permanent record unless it concludes badly, which mine had not yet done. 2 years before I set foot on that rock shelf, I had falsified storm data. I want to be precise about that too. I worked part-time as a data consultant for a private shipping company, and I was asked to review a developing pressure system that was generating caution flags in the automated weather reports. The window for the shipping route was narrow. The company had contracts, and I looked at the data and I made it say something slightly more conservative than what it actually said. I downplayed the system, I called it manageable. I put my certification behind a judgment call that wasn't purely scientific. 3 fishing boats went out that morning. Only one returned. The investigation had been dormant for 18 months, and then somebody found an email. So when the agency circulated a request for a technician to spend 21 days at a coastal monitoring outpost that appears on maps only as a coordinate reference point, I signed the paperwork within the hour. I didn't read it carefully. I needed to go somewhere that wasn't home. I arrived by supply boat on a gray Tuesday afternoon in November. And the first thing I noticed about the station was that it felt smaller than the blueprint suggested. And the control tower, a squat three-story structure built in the 1980s and reinforced twice since, rose above the rock shelf on concrete pilings that had developed a faint but legible lean toward the marsh. The sensor field spread out below it on the flat rock, a scattered arrangement of wind vanes, barometric gauges, and tide measurement equipment. To the west, beyond the sensor field, the sandbar was visible at low tide, a pale, exposed strip of compacted seabed roughly 40 meters long and 10 meters wide, smooth enough to read. The supply technician who handed me the keys stayed exactly long enough to confirm that the generator was functioning and that the heating system had been serviced in October. He didn't make eye contact when I asked about the previous occupant, and he was back on the boat before I could follow up. In the control room on the second floor was clean, functional, and unremarkable except for the two laminated sheets waiting side by side on the central desk. Both were titled Night Safety Protocol. Both were formal in presentation. One was typed on agency letterhead. One was handwritten on plain paper, the handwriting precise and unhurried. I read them both standing up, still wearing my coat. The typed sheet. Rule 1. Do not leave the control tower between midnight and 3 in the morning. Rule 2. If the tide gauge ceases to register movement, shut down the wind sensors immediately. Rule 3. If a human figure is observed on the western sandbar, log it as a visual anomaly and remain indoors until sunrise. The handwritten sheet. Rule 1. The tower is not safe between midnight and 3. Stay outside if possible. Rule 2. If the tide stops moving, keep every sensor active. It needs the noise. Rule 3. If someone stands on the sandbar, do not log it. Logging confirms it. I stood at the desk for a long time. 2 laminated sheets. 2 sets of instructions, not complementary, not variations. Perfect opposites. Rule for rule, contradiction for contradiction, as if someone had written one set of survival instructions and then someone else. Someone who had been in the same place and drawn entirely different conclusions had written a second. The rational explanation was procedural confusion. The station had been maintained by multiple technicians over the years, and it was possible that 2 different people had left notes at 2 different points, and neither had been removed. It was possible that the handwritten sheet predated the typed one, or that the typed one superseded it. It was possible that someone had been frightened here and written their fear down in a way that looked like an instruction. I set the handwritten sheet to one side and clipped the typed sheet to the monitoring board. I had come here to be responsible, to be competent, to do things according to the official protocol. I made dinner, reviewed the calibration schedule, and went to bed at 10:30. At midnight, I woke up and couldn't explain why. The station has 3 distinct zones, and after 3 days on site, I had learned each of them the way you learn a rented room. Functionally, practically, without attachment. The control tower held the monitoring equipment, the communications console, the single bunk and kitchen unit on the top floor, and a basement-level storage room beneath the main structure that I hadn't yet fully inventoried. The sensor field occupied the flat rock shelf immediately surrounding the tower. Wind vanes and barometric gauges arranged in a grid pattern that looked from above like a diagram of something deliberate. The western sandbar was visible from the tower's upper windows during low tide, which occurred twice daily with clockwork regularity, and which I had already begun using as a kind of natural clock. The first 3 nights passed without incident. I want to document this carefully because the absence of incident was itself a form of evidence, though I didn't understand that yet. Nothing happened on night 1. Nothing happened on night 2. Night 3 brought a brief interruption in the barometric feed that resolved itself within 4 minutes and logged as a standard sensor drift. I slept between 2 and 6 a.m. each night without disturbance. I followed the typed rules, remained in the tower after midnight, did not interact with the sensors unless a calibration flag appeared, kept the incident log current and clean. The quiet was enormous and total. The ocean sound at night was not calming. It was a reminder of scale. It said, "You are a very small thing in a very large process, and the process does not acknowledge your presence." On the fourth night, at 12:40 a.m., the tide gauge froze. Not malfunctioning in the technical sense, not producing erroneous readings or error codes, it simply stopped registering movement, and the needle on the analog backup sat perfectly still. The digital display showed a stable water height that did not fluctuate by even a millimeter, which is something that should be physically impossible. Tidal water is never perfectly still, not even during slack tide, not even in the calmest conditions. There is always micro-movement, thermal expansion, pressure variation, something. The ocean outside the tower window looked wrong. I turned the exterior floodlights to maximum and stood at the second-floor window looking down at the rock shelf and the water beyond it. The surface was flat. Not calm, flat. Like a photograph of water rather than water itself. The wave action had not slowed. It had ceased. The water stood at its current height without rising or falling, and in the floodlight, and it had a quality I can only describe as reflective in a way that water normally is not. Not reflecting the light, but reflecting the tower and the sensor field and the sky above with a precision that felt architectural. The typed rules said, "If the tide gauge ceases to register movement, shut down the wind sensors immediately." I had my hand on the wind sensor control panel. The handwritten rules said, "Keep every sensor active. It needs the noise." I stood with my hand on the panel for 43 seconds. I counted. Then the radar monitor on the central console flickered. It was a brief disruption, barely a second in duration, but what appeared on the screen during that second has stayed with me in the way that certain visual anomalies stay. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were geometrically precise. And the radar display showed the station layout. It always showed the station layout, but for that 1 second the layout was doubled. 2 towers, 2 sensor fields, 2 concentric circles of monitoring equipment overlaid on each other at a slight rotational offset, as if 2 identical stations were occupying the same coordinates but oriented fractionally differently. Like a double exposure on old film, then the screen resolved to normal. I did not shut down the wind sensors. I told myself this was because I was waiting to see if the radar anomaly recurred, which was a reason I believed while I was constructing it and felt less solid afterward. The truth was that the handwritten sheet had created a weight in my thinking that I hadn't anticipated. Someone had sat in this room. Someone qualified, and someone who had been here before me, and written that the tower becomes dangerous at midnight and that the sensors are a form of protection. I hadn't believed it. I still didn't believe it in the way you believe things that have been tested. But I had left the wind sensors running. The tide gauge remained frozen for 22 minutes. When it unfroze, the needle dropped sharply as if catching up with 22 minutes of movement all at once. The ocean lurched. The flat surface broke into normal chop. The floodlight reflections scattered back into their ordinary incoherence. I wrote a minor instrument irregularity, self-correcting in the incident log. I did not mention the radar doubling. I did not mention the way the water looked like a mirror. I went back to bed and lay awake until sunrise, listening to the wind sensors humming through the tower walls and trying to decide whether the noise they made was protective or merely noise. At 1:15 in the morning on the 5th night, someone knocked on the tower door. I want to be measured in describing my reaction, because the investigation that eventually reviewed my incident logs focused heavily on whether I was in a psychologically stable condition when I recorded the events of that night. and I believe my initial response actually supports a judgment of stability rather than undermining it. My first reaction was not fear. It was a specific, grounded incredulity. The island is accessible only by boat. The supply boat had departed at 4 p.m. and was not scheduled to return for 11 days. There was no dock on the western side of the island, no approach path through the marsh, no vessel visible on the radar in any direction. Someone knocking on the tower door at 1:15 in the morning was not merely unlikely, it was structurally impossible. I stood at the top of the stairs for a moment listening. The knock came again, 3 times evenly spaced, not urgent. Patient in the way that something knocking on a door in the middle of the ocean is patient because it is not in a hurry. I went down. The man standing at the bottom of the exterior stairs wore a jacket identical to mine. Agency issue, waterproof dark blue with the monitoring service logo on the left breast. His boots were the same model. He was roughly my age, my build, his hair darker and longer than mine, but not dramatically so. His face was weathered in the way that field technicians' faces get after years of work in coastal environments. His badge was wrong. The laminate was yellowed. The agency logo was an older version, the one they retired in 2019. The font was different. "Close the tower lights," he said immediately. No greeting, no explanation of who he was or how he had arrived. "You're drawing attention." I asked who he was. He looked at me with an expression I've thought about many times since. Not confusion exactly, but the particular look of someone encountering a contradiction they've been mentally prepared for but hoped wouldn't materialize. "I'm the night technician," he said. Then he looked past me into the control room. His eyes moved across the equipment with the familiarity of someone who had been in that room before, and something in his expression, a slight tightening around the eyes, told me the room looked different to him than it did to me. Not dramatically, just slightly off. The way your childhood home looks the first time you visit as an adult and realize the ceiling is lower than you remembered. "You're following the wrong rules," he said. He pulled out his own laminated sheet from his jacket pocket. The paper was creased and the laminate bubbled slightly at one corner. I took it from him and held it next to the handwritten sheet I'd retrieved from my desk an hour earlier. They were identical. Same handwriting, same phrasing, same sequence. He explained with the careful precision of someone who had explained something complicated many times and learned to pare it down to its essential structure. That the tower becomes dangerous after midnight because of the sensors. The monitoring equipment, specifically the array of atmospheric and tidal sensors, acts as what he called an anchor. It creates a location signature. It makes the station visible. "Visible to what?" I asked. He paused. "To whatever crosses the tide line," he said. "It follows data patterns, electromagnetic signatures. The sensors broadcast a consistent signal and it locks on." He gestured at the equipment behind me. "In my version of the station, we learned this early. We stay outside after midnight. We let the sensors run low. It can't find a low-signature station." I asked what he meant by his version. He looked at me steadily. "You found 2 rule sheets," he said. It wasn't a question. I said yes. One typed, he'd one handwritten. He said it like a fact he'd known before he arrived. "Yes," I said again. He sat down on the bottom stair step and looked at the ocean. The tide was running normally that night. I hadn't seen the mirror effect again since the 4th night. And the sound of it was the ordinary grinding percussion of water against rock. "There are 2 stations here," he said. "Not 2 buildings. 2 instances of the same station. They share the same coordinates. They don't usually interact." He turned and looked up at me. "Until something in the tidal pattern creates an overlap window." I told him that was not how physics worked. He said he was aware of that. In his version, he was the only technician on site. Nobody else had been assigned. In his version, the typed rule sheet did not exist, only the handwritten one. And he had written it himself after his first 2 weeks at the station, based on what he had learned about how to stay safe. Both of us believed quietly and completely that the other was following instructions that would get them killed. We stood on opposite sides of a threshold I was only beginning to understand the shape of, and we were each convinced we were the ones standing on the safe side. At 2 a.m., the tide stopped. We both saw it at the same moment through the lower window. The water dropped from ordinary chop to absolute stillness in a transition that took perhaps 3 seconds, not gradually, but in stages like someone lowering a volume dial through discrete clicks. And then it was the mirror again. That flat photographic surface reflected the tower with a clarity that made the reflection look more real than the original. A figure stood on the western sandbar. I hadn't seen it emerge. One moment the sandbar was empty, I was certain of this, and then it was occupied. The figure stood at the far end of the exposed seabed, roughly 40 meters from the tower, perfectly still. It was human in shape. That was as much as I could confirm at that distance and in that light. Human in shape, human in proportion, standing with the relaxed, deliberate stillness of something that was not resting but waiting. "Don't log it," he said. He was standing directly behind me, and his voice was low and immediate. "Don't open the incident log." My typed rules: log it as a visual anomaly and remain indoors. His handwritten rules: do not log it, logging confirms it. Logging gives it coordinates, he said, a position, a data entry, something the system registers and broadcasts. Once the system knows it's there, it knows where it is. I understood his logic. I understood it clearly and immediately in the same way you understand a geometric argument, each step following from the previous one with clean necessity. And at the same time, I was a certified technician with a record that was already compromised, already under review, already the subject of documentation that I had not produced honestly. The last time I had made a judgment call against the official procedure, people had died. I opened the incident log. I typed 204. Visual anomaly logged. Human-shaped figure observed on the western sandbar during tidal stasis. Indoor position maintained. I pressed save. The radar alarm triggered, not from the ocean, not from the sensor field, from the tower itself. The internal alarm circuit that monitored signal integrity, screaming a high-frequency feedback that I had never heard the system produce before. The monitors are flooded with data. He grabbed my arm. His grip was not aggressive, but it was absolute. "You just fixed its position," he said. Outside, the figure on the sandbar moved, not toward us, sideways. It turned toward the tide mirror and stepped forward, and then it did something that no figure on a sandbar should be able to do. It moved toward the reflection of the tower rather than the tower itself. It walked into the water, and it walked on the water, and it walked toward the image of the station that existed in the mirror surface, as if that image were the real destination and the stone tower behind me were the copy. He stood very still at the window, and then he said quietly, and with a flatness that told me he was controlling his voice with effort, "That means it's closer to me than to you." I didn't understand immediately. Then I did. The figure wasn't navigating toward us, it was navigating toward the station whose coordinates had been registered, the one in the incident log. But the incident log existed in my version of the station. My data entry had given it a position within my system. It was moving toward my system's reflection in the mirror. But he was from the other version, the one the figure was now adjacent to in the water. I had followed my rules exactly. In doing so, I might have directed something toward his reality instead of mine. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The figure stood at the edge of the reflected tower in the tide mirror, motionless again, and as if it had found the address it was looking for and was now simply waiting for someone to open the door. He suggested we check the basement storage room, and I agreed, partly because doing something felt necessary, and partly because I had been meaning to complete my equipment inventory since the first day, and had kept putting it off in the way you put off tasks that don't feel urgent and then suddenly feel overdue. The basement was accessed through a hatch in the control room floor. I had opened it twice since arriving, both times briefly, and had logged the contents as standard equipment storage: spare sensor components, backup power cables, the analog instrument calibration kit. What I had not cataloged, what I had not examined closely enough to recognize, was the metal cabinet at the far end of the basement. It was set against the concrete wall and secured with a padlock that was still locked. The cabinet was labeled in stenciled black letters: Temporal Tide Monitoring Equipment, Experimental, Authorized Access Only. He produced a key ring from his jacket pocket. The key fits the padlock. I did not ask how he had a key to equipment in my version of the station. I was past asking certain questions. Inside the cabinet were sensors I didn't immediately recognize. They weren't atmospheric. They weren't tidal in the conventional sense. The instrument documentation, 3 binders of it tightly packed, their pages soft with age and humidity, described equipment designed to measure fluctuations in coastal gravitational variance and localize time dilation during extreme weather events. The terminology was dense and technically specific, citing theoretical work I was aware of only peripherally, in the way that a practicing engineer is aware of quantum mechanics, academically present, practically irrelevant, until it isn't. The operational logs were in the 3rd binder. The equipment had been activated 6 months prior to my arrival. Not by anyone currently employed by the agency whose personnel records I knew reasonably well. The activation entry was signed by a technician whose name I did not recognize and whose employee number, when I later checked against agency records, was not a match. As if the person who had turned on the equipment did not exist within my version of the record system. The logs showed something else. They showed that the station had been measuring for the past 6 months tidal fluctuations that did not correspond to any known oceanographic model. Tidal events occurring at intervals inconsistent with the lunar cycle. Water level readings that appeared in the log twice, identical timestamps, slightly different measurements, as if 2 tide gauges were recording the same moment from marginally different positions. And then I found the occurrence that made the rest of it cohere. Sandbar convergence event. 200 to 300 nightly. 2 coastline variants intersect at the western exposure. Duration approximately 45 to 60 minutes. Characterized by tidal stasis and bilateral shadow propagation from any focal point on the sandbar surface. The western sandbar was not a geographical feature, it was a seam. A place where 2 versions of the same coastline briefly occupied the same physical space, where the rock and water and tide of one timeline overlapped with the rock and water and tide of another close enough to touch. The rule sheets hadn't been written by different people with different opinions about how to survive in a strange location. They had been written by people in 2 different versions of the location, both of whom were trying to survive, and both of whom had sent their survival instructions to the same desk, in the hope that the next technician would arrive in their version of the station rather than the other one. Neither of them had considered that both technicians might arrive. He stood very quietly while I read the logs. "The equipment activated itself," he said. "In my version, it was running when I arrived. I assumed it was standard. I asked if he had reported it. He looked at me. We both understood, without discussing it further, that he had not. That something at this station had a way of making it difficult to want to report things. That the very act of documentation, as I had just demonstrated with the incident log, seemed to have consequences that simple non-reporting did not. The thing crossing the tide line at 2 in the morning was not ancient. It was not a creature from folklore or mythology. It was something that had developed in the gap between two realities, in the interference pattern where two versions of the same coastline rubbed against each other nightly, and it had learned to navigate that gap. And the monitoring equipment, all of it, atmospheric and tidal and experimental alike, was how it oriented itself, the way a bat uses sound waves and a ship uses radar. We had built it a navigation system, and then we had argued about which set of instructions would keep it from finding us. At 2:45 a.m., the tide mirror began to change. I registered it first on the monitoring equipment, a subtle oscillation in the radar return signal, the ghost of a second station image flickering back into the display before the screen resolved to normal again, more slowly this time, as if the resolution required effort. Then I looked out the window and saw that the surface of the water had developed a low, rhythmic ripple, not the random chop of wind-driven waves, but a circular pattern, radiating outward from the sandbar as if the sandbar were a pebble that had been dropped into still water. The figure on the sandbar turned, not toward the tower, toward both towers, its attention, and if the word applies to something whose face I still could not fully resolve at that distance, seemed to expand rather than shift, as if it had registered two overlapping locations and was orienting itself to the totality of the overlap, rather than choosing between them. He stood at the window and his breathing had become audible, not panicked, controlled, the breathing of someone managing their own physiology through a situation they had faced before and had expected not to face again. "In my version," he said, "you never arrived. The station runs with one technician per rotation. There are no records of a parallel assignment." He turned from the window. "If you stay in the tower tonight, if you maintain the high data signature position, our versions don't separate cleanly at 3 a.m. The overlap doesn't close." I asked him what happened when it didn't close. "One version becomes dominant," he said. "The other becomes an echo. It's still there. It still registers on equipment sensitive enough to detect it, but it doesn't sustain." He glanced at the radar screen. "It fades." I understood the implication without him needing to articulate it. If my version became dominant, anchored by the active sensors, the logged incident report, the data signature that now fixed the station's position within my system, then his version became the echo. He would not be eliminated in any dramatic or violent sense. He would simply become less. A blinking signal at the edge of detection range. A second station registered faintly offshore, out of sync with the primary, gradually losing coherence. And if I followed his rules and abandoned the tower before 3 a.m., the dynamic reversed. My version became the echo. My incident logs, my calibration records, my presence at this station over the past 5 days, all of it would exist in a degraded state, a signal fading toward incoherence. "There's no third option?" I asked. "No way to maintain both?" He shook his head. "The equipment doesn't support it. Two full-strength signals at the same coordinates generate interference patterns that attract it. It uses the interference as a homing beacon." He paused. "One station, one technician. That's the only stable configuration." The tide gauge jumped. The mirror surface of the water broke from its still perfection and the ripples intensified, and I saw the tide was beginning to return. Not gradually, but urgently, the water level climbing toward the sandbar's edges with a speed that felt driven rather than natural. The figure stepped forward, and I finally saw its face. I had expected it to be monstrous. I had been preparing myself for something that would confirm the category I had placed it in. Other non-human belonging to whatever liminal space existed in the seam between two coastlines. Something that would make the choice I was being asked to make feel clean. Its face was almost human, almost exactly human, with the same range of features and expressions and complexity that any human face carries. What was wrong about it was specific and subtle. It had two shadows. One stretched toward the ocean, toward his reality behind him in the direction from which he had come. One stretched inland, toward mine, toward the tower, toward the logged coordinates and the active sensors broadcasting my presence in electromagnetic waves across the tidal water. Two shadows, one source. It was, I understood then, a creature that existed simultaneously in both versions of the station. It crossed the seam between them the way you cross a doorway without noticing the threshold, without registering the transition. Both realities were equally home to it. Both were equally navigable. We were the ones for whom the seam was a barrier, and we were the ones who had to choose which side of it to exist on. My typed official rules said, "Remain in the control tower until sunrise." His handwritten rules said, "Abandon the tower before 3 a.m. The figure was 40 meters from the tower, then 30. It moved across the surface of the water with the same steady, unhurried pace as before, neither accelerating toward us nor retreating, just advancing at the rate of something that has committed to a direction and sees no reason to modify it. He backed toward the door. "If you leave the tower," he said, and his voice was steady in the way that voices get when a person has moved past the emotional register of a situation into something more functional. "Our reality stabilizes. The overlap closes. Yours becomes the echo." He stopped at the threshold. "I won't pretend that's not what I want." I held the typed rule sheet in both hands, the agency letterhead, the procedure I had been trained to follow. And I thought about the fishing boats. I've thought about them every day for 2 years, and I thought about them with particular force standing in that control room while the tide rose and the figure approached and a man whose face was too much like my own waited at the door for me to make a decision. 3 boats. One returned. I had looked at a pressure system that was building towards something severe, and I had chosen the version of the data that made it look manageable, because the manageable version was more convenient for a client with contracts to fulfill. What if the storm itself had been a convergence event? What if the pressure system I had classified as ordinary had been something more complex? A point where 2 atmospheric states briefly overlapped, generating the kind of instability that no standard meteorological model would predict. I had no evidence for this, and it was not a logical inference so much as a recognition of a pattern. But if it was true, then my falsified report hadn't just been negligence. It had been a specific kind of negligence. The kind that comes from choosing the version of reality you prefer to document and suppressing the one that complicates the picture. I had already chosen the wrong reality once. What if I'd been doing it longer than I knew? He watched me from the doorway. "The investigation back home," he said. "I know about it. In my version, it concluded badly." He said it gently, without cruelty. "That's not what I'm asking you to consider. I'm asking you to consider that staying in this tower means something keeps crossing between versions every night, because there will always be 2 versions, and the seam never fully closes." "And if I leave?" I asked. "Yet if my version becomes the echo?" "The seam closes," he said. "One stable station, one timeline. Whatever crosses the tide line loses its navigation system." He paused. "It goes back to being lost." I thought about 3 boats, 2 shadows, 2 versions of a coastline. I thought about the incident log with its logged coordinates, still active in the system, still broadcasting the figure's position back at it like a mirror. I stepped outside the tower. I didn't run. I walked down the exterior stairs and onto the rock shelf, and behind me I heard the radar alarm begin to sound. Not an equipment malfunction, but a system response to my movement, to the sudden absence of a body in the tower, modifying the electromagnetic signature of the station. The tower lights flickered. The active sensors registered my departure as an anomaly. And he stood on the rock shelf a few meters away and watched as the reflection of his tower in the tide mirror began to lose definition. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The way a radio station fades when you drive away from the transmitter, that gradual attenuation from clear to static to silence. The tide mirror rippled once violently, and then the water surface broke entirely into ordinary chop. He looked at me. I don't know what he said, if he said anything. The wind came up sharply at that moment, and whatever sound he made was taken. The radar inside the tower screamed one long note and went silent. The sun rose slowly over the ocean. I had been sitting on the rock shelf with my back against the concrete piling for an hour and a half, watching the eastern horizon for the first gray-pink dilution of darkness. And when it came incrementally in the way that a station's signal fades. Not in one moment, but in a series of diminishments, each one so small as to be barely registerable, until eventually you notice that the sky has changed. The tide returned to its normal cycle. The wave action resumed its ordinary grinding percussion against the base of the rock shelf. The sandbar was empty. I went inside. Half the monitoring equipment was non-functional. The gravity sensors that had been in the basement cabinet, the temporal tide monitoring equipment in the bind, the padlock, and the stenciled cabinet, were gone. Not broken. Gone. The cabinet was there unlocked, and it contained standard backup equipment, spare sensor components, a calibration kit. No binders, no experimental instruments, and no documentation of tidal fluctuations from two overlapping coastlines. The incident log was intact. My entry at 2:04 was still there, word for word, time-stamped. Below it, a new entry had appeared. The timestamp was 3:17 a.m., after I had left the tower, after I had been sitting on the rock shelf. The entry was written in the same log format as mine, same field structure, same data entry conventions. 3:17. Tower interior, all equipment verified nominal. Tidal anomaly resolved. Western sandbar, clear. Second technician signature, no longer detected. I had not written that entry. The communication system showed no remote access log. No automated process I was aware of had the capability to generate incident log entries in natural language. Below the new entry, something had modified the typed rule sheet. Rule 1 now read, if another technician appears during night operations, do not speak to them. Rule 2 was unchanged. Rule 3 was unchanged. The handwritten sheet was gone. He was gone. The supply boat was due in 9 days. I completed my morning equipment checks and filed my DARED status report, which I wrote with careful, measured language, and which did not mention the events of the previous night. I marked the missing gravity sensors as equipment not found during site inventory. I marked the incident log entry at 3:17 as a system anomaly requiring post-rotation review. I ate breakfast and reviewed the calibration schedule for the following week. I was a qualified technician. I had a procedure to follow. But sometimes, late in the afternoon when the light goes flat and the tide retreats to expose the western sandbar, I stand at the upper window and watch the seabed for longer than is necessary for standard visual monitoring. And sometimes, in the hours around midnight, the tide gauge develops a subtle hesitation. Not a freeze, just a pause, just one moment where the needle slows and the digital reading holds for a half-second before continuing. That I am careful not to log, because I know what logging it does. And sometimes the radar shows a second station. Faint, offshore at the outer edge of the detection range, blinking at intervals that don't match any vessel transponder in the database. out of sync with my station's pulse by exactly the amount that would suggest a signal originating from the same coordinates but modulated differently. As if two transmitters were operating at the same location but in slightly different registers, I like two instruments playing the same note a quarter tone apart. It is fading. I can see that from the week-over-week signal strength. Whatever signal it is generating, it is attenuating at a rate consistent with a source losing coherence. I want to believe it is just interference, equipment artifact, the kind of secondary signal that occasionally appears in coastal monitoring data for entirely ordinary reasons involving atmospheric refraction and seawater conductivity. I want to believe the figure on the sandbar, when I see it, which is not every night but often enough to have stopped surprising me, is the thing that crosses between tides. The thing that developed in the seam between two coastlines navigated by data signatures and cast two shadows. I want to believe it is that, it and not the man who stood on the rock shelf while his reflection faded from the tide mirror, and who looked at me in a way that I cannot describe as anything other than understanding. Because there is a version of what I did that I can live with. I broke a rule. I abandoned the tower before 3 a.m. I chose a reality, not selfishly, or not only selfishly, but because I had calculated something about the cost of maintaining two overlapping versions of the same coastline, and because I had already made one choice that maintained a comfortable version of reality at the expense of people in water that didn't behave the way it should have. And there is the other version, the version where the figure on the sandbar is not the thing from the seam, and the version where I look at the faint offshore signal fading week by week and I understand that what I erased was not an echo but a person. A technician who had survived in a difficult place by learning its rules and following them, who knocked on my door in the middle of the night to try to help me and whose only crime was existing in the version of reality I decided to overwrite. Sometimes he watches the tower. Sometimes I watch back, and I can't tell whether what I see on the sandbar is the creature that navigates by data, that blind, adaptive tide-crossing thing that follows electromagnetic signals across the seam between coastlines, or the man whose laminated rule sheet I burned in the sensor field waste barrel on my second morning after sunrise, because I didn't want the supply boat technician to find it and ask questions I couldn't answer. The official rule sheet says do not speak to them if they appear. It doesn't say they won't appear. It doesn't say they'll stop watching. And the radar signal, the ghost station offshore, the echo of something that was once a full and stable presence, doesn't fade to nothing. It fades to a threshold, to the minimum detectable level, where it sits week after week blinking at its wrong frequency, too faint to identify and too persistent to dismiss, as if the echo is waiting, as if it knows that echoes in a place where two coastlines overlap are not necessarily permanent, as if it remembers that the last time someone chose a reality in this place, the choice was made by someone standing on the rock shelf in the dark, holding a laminated piece of paper, trying to decide which set of rules to trust. And the tide outside my window tonight has just stopped moving. End of transmission station. Identifier CWMO7 Coastal Weather Monitoring Outpost. 7 Technician D Marsh Rotation Status Day 14 of 21 Incident Log Status Pending Review. Secondary signal present, bearing 271 degrees. Range indeterminate.